Welcome to the Political Risk Podcast. You're listening to an independent pod focused on geopolitics, serving risk professionals and decision makers across specialty insurance markets, reinsurance and beyond. I'm your host David Benyon, and I'm joined for this episode by Marvin Barth, creator of Thematic Markets, independent research that brings a uniquely broad perspective to the global political economy, integrating rigorous research and analytics with experience that spans markets across asset classes, academia, central banking, finance ministry, and international institutions. Trained in economics to PhD level, Marvin has worked as an economist, strategist, and portfolio manager at major global banks, asset managers, and across the policy spectrum, including the US Federal Reserve Board, the US Treasury Department, and the Bank for International Settlements. Based in California, Marvin lives in London. This episode is dedicated to the political risk, political violence, and geopolitical fallout as a result of the shock landslide US election victory of President-elect Donald Trump. Well, it wasn't quite as much of a shock to Marvin because he predicted this. So, I hope you enjoy our conversation together. Let's get into it. Well, first of all, Marvin, thank you so much for joining me. It's great to have you on the podcast.
Well, thank you, Dave. I'm really glad to be here, and thank you for having me on.
Well, let me start with an apology because in some ways, I should have really had you on the podcast about a month ago because your superb analysis of the polling, you really did call this one right, I think it's fair to say. So this would be your victory lap.
Well, yes, it's great when things go your way. They don't always. This one did, and it has been a bit surprising to me that 3 elections in a row, I seem to have nailed what most of the professional political community can't seem to get right, including the data scientists in that space. So I do find that quite interesting. And I think as somebody who has a fairly quantitative background, it's a quite interesting point to me that perhaps we have far too much quantification of things and not enough thinking about things, because you need to do the thinking part to make the quantification work.
So how has the result vindicated your analysis?
One thing is just highlighting that you do need to do that thinking that I just mentioned in terms of how do you set up the problem. So I think a lot of people approach the problem as, well, I'm going to poll or predict through some sort of economic model or otherwise the election result. And I'm going to go back and look at the past data and compile that all together. And certainly that should be a part of it, but you need to frame what the current situation is. There's, of course, the old Mark Twain quote about history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. So yes, you can learn stuff from the past, but you have to understand how the current context fits. And often there aren't data around that. So if you want to do data analysis, you have to figure out, well, how do I tease out of the data what I can, given that those data are limited to, say, certain areas, even if they don't address the exact question I want. And so one of the things that we've seen is that the data that we do have, polling data, has been persistently biased for the last several elections. And fortunately, I'd done a lot of research into what was driving those things. So my approach was to focus on, okay, let's not try and identify what the actual result is going to be. Let's try and identify what the bias is in everybody else's results and just adjust their results accordingly. You know, if you know what you're looking for, there are very clear statistical signs of bias in data when you subject them to a variety of different tests, which is one of the things I did. And from that, you know, once I established there was very clearly bias and I could tell what direction the bias leaned in, then it was really an exercise in, well, what is the magnitude of that? And that's much harder. And so that's where I was a bit squishy. You know, I said, look, we're somewhere between a very tight race that leans in Trump's favor and a complete landslide for him. And I think it probably errs in the direction of the landslide. And that was based on a lot of different, again, statistical measures in there. But again, it's because I framed the question quite differently from the way most other people did, but I was still doing quantitative analysis.
I've been looking at your Substack for a while now, and back in August, your post, and now the fun begins, where you said it was plausible that Trump would not only win a landslide in the Electoral College, but the national popular vote too, giving him that mandate.
It was something that I think was apparent in the polling all the way back then. I updated things a week before the election, looking through the more recent polling data. And what I'd found is that the degree of bias had actually increased under my measurements, and yet Harris's polling lead had fallen. So that was a really clear sign. Things were not going to go well for her.
So who is it that you primarily write for example, through your Substack?
So my client base are pretty broad, and I would think about it as decision makers who need to navigate the complexities of the global political economy. And so that ranges from hedge fund portfolio managers to CIO asset allocators, chief risk officers, and even CEOs, global business leaders trying to make decisions, both in the short run and in the very long run. And the reason why my research can hit all of those areas is really I'm trying to explain what is driving the global political economy and thus markets. You know, the crossover with your listenership is, I think, quite fair and reasonable.
Let's talk about the very recent, so we're talking on Friday, so it's yesterday's Fed announcement. Let's give your first just kind of hot take on that.
So I think this is really important. What are the risks that you are exposed to? And, you know, there are two really big themes that I've been emphasizing in the economy for a while that have been crucial to my being, I think, very ahead of the curve in terms of thinking where the Fed was going to go, which is one, this idea of localization. I think you've heard a lot of people talk about deglobalization and the threat to global trade and fragmenting of the World Trading Organization. All of those things actually came after we already started to see globalization peak and start to reverse. And that was because technology was actually making it a lot easier to produce things locally more cheaply than you could using even the cheapest labor somewhere else in the rest of the world. Locate your production right next to where your wealthy clients are. So you actually see a shift in the pattern of global trade, investment flows, starting in about 2011, 2012. Way before people started talking about all this trade protectionism or even the COVID effects. But those things, of course, obviously accelerated. And what that has meant is that there's this massive investment boom taking place that's driving up the underlying marginal product of capital. And that's where the neutral real interest rate comes with. So where a lot of people were surprised, oh, if the Fed hikes beyond 2%, the economy is going to crash. And they were shocked that the Fed hiked above 5% and it didn't happen. Big reason of that is that the neutral rate is a lot higher than markets think. It's a lot higher, much higher than the Fed thinks. The other big driver was, of course, inflation. And I think there people really misunderstood what was driving inflation. You know, the whole sort of transitory debate really rotated around it being purely a supply shock caused by COVID. They didn't seem to get that it was a supply shock, a demand shock associated with this big CapEx boom I just mentioned that, as I said, got accelerated by COVID. And that central banks around the world going into this had been telling everyone they could, hey, we're going to err on the side of letting inflation get out of control. And so beliefs changed, and beliefs matter. Once people believe inflation is supposed to be higher, they actually accept higher prices. Producers start changing their prices to reflect that, and it becomes much more embedded. And that's why it was so much more persistent. Why do I give you that sort of background? It's because the Fed is still stuck at thinking that neutral rates are a lot lower than they are. And they have really ignored that being is believing effect. They think that they have solved the inflation problem. And I warned over the summer that we would see a rebound in inflation. And I've warned about this multiple times. I warned about it at the end of last year when they also thought that they were done and that they could start cutting at the beginning of this year. Of course, inflation prevented them from doing that. I warned that the same thing would happen here, but they seemed so committed they were likely to make a policy error. And that is exactly what they did when they cut by 50 basis points back in September. We've just had the rebound in inflation that I mentioned. We've also had solid jobs reports. The most recent one was mixed up by both strikes and hurricanes, but still the underlying data seem to suggest that the economy is doing very well, growing above trend. And yet they decided to cut again. And I think they're really risking losing control of the bond market here.
I mean, that's something that really does matter to an insurance audience. There was a major rally in equities after the election result, but that hasn't been the case in bond markets. And there's been talk of, the Fed being spooked by losing control after a yield spike in 10-year treasury bonds. And, are bond markets losing faith?
They definitely are. We're starting to see the bond market vigilantes come back. This is a real risk ultimately to broader asset prices if that continues. So I was actually surprised by the decision yesterday that there were no dissents whatsoever and that there were no hints in the statement that they were concerned about the loss of control over the bond market, because that move in the bond market, it didn't start with the election. It didn't start with people's perceptions of Trump winning. It started literally within an hour of the Fed's 50 basis point cut. That's when it started. And it was very clearly people losing faith in the Fed's ability to control this. So this is exactly what I would be looking for going forward is, do you see some sort of sign of recognition of that in their speaking over the course of the next month? Or do they just proceed as they've promised and do another cut in December? If that's the case, I think, bond markets are going to be pretty ugly.
For insurers, certainly those that do political risk, they're going to be very interested in sovereign bond performance in emerging markets, not just the US, not just the developed economies. Is it possible to follow your thinking through to some of the likely consequences more globally?
In terms of what this means for the rest of the world, this is really bad for the rest of the world, and I would argue emerging markets. In fact, when I first started writing about this phenomenon of localization that I referred to earlier, I did it in a piece entitled Rethinking Emerging Markets, i.e. the idea that you should go to emerging markets for growth. Well, emerging markets have been the countries that have been most dependent on globalization for their growth. And that growth has not only come from demand growth from the US current account deficit, but also from the transfer of technology and capital to those economies that was part of globalization. But if it reverses, those economies now need to come up with their own technology, their own capital. That's a real problem. And as we've seen, emerging markets have underperformed since exactly 2012 when I said all those capital decisions started to change. What that means going forward is that the US is having this massive capex boom because it seems to be doing this localization more than anything else. Since we have a global capital market, it is basically hoovering up all the capital from the rest of the world. And the fact that it's going to need to do a lot of defense expenditure, which, we can perhaps get into, but they're not the only ones. Everyone is going to have to ramp up defense budgets, means that that's going to increase that demand for the rest of the world's capital. But the US is the one that's delivering you the high returns. It's not the emerging markets. And so the emerging markets have been increasingly turning towards debt. You can see this most significantly in a place like Brazil that is absolutely not on any type of sustainable path in terms of debt. I mean, it's one of the worst sustainability stories in the world, actually. And it's shocking that people continue to invest there. But if you have the US hoovering up all the capital while these guys are trying to do it, it has to have an effect on their real interest rates, which just worsens the quality of their credit because they aren't having the same accompanying growth that the US is.
I'd like to spend a lot of time looking forward rather than back on this episode, looking at the consequences of this election. But perhaps there's something in there about what you do differently that's allowed you to see something in this election and previous elections that others haven't.
You can answer both questions at once there. I mean, one was if you think about what I said about you have to think about the problem before you try and quantify it effectively. So, what was the underlying source of bias? If you can identify that, then you can go out and seek to quantify it. Maybe you won't be able to, maybe the data don't exist, but if they do, you can go quantify that and make decisions about how that's likely to affect the future. Even if you can't quantify it, you can at least go through scenario analysis or set up hypothesis tests about how your theories might play out in the future in single events that can help increase your confidence that you're on the right path. And that's really, I think, what was crucial to understanding that election result is understanding the source of the bias. And one of the reasons why I think on a forward-looking basis, this is still very troubling to me is, it's early days. We're 3-4 days past the election now, but I still hear, and it's not just the Democrats, right? It's not just the Democrats saying we didn't do anything wrong. We had a great candidate. We had a great story. It was just white male anger and racism drove this. You see the exact same thing. I've been shocked to see actual Republican strategists and Trump campaign members talking about this, oh, yes, the underrepresented white male voice. And the thing is that there were massive gains across the board. The biggest gains, I think, actually come from minority voters. Like for some of your listeners, they may not be aware of how monolithic the black vote in the United States has been. The earliest polling we have on this goes back to the late 60s. But since the late 60s, Democrats have reliably gotten almost exactly 90% of the black vote every single election, year in, year out. And this time it looks like he got something like 20% of black men. Yes, fewer black women, but still, even among black women, he made inroads. So if you are thinking that this is a model of just white racism and that it's shy Trump voters, you're going to miss the phenomenon. The phenomenon here is a sense of disenfranchisement among people of all stripes, religions, colors, who all feel that their voices are not being heard in Washington and are increasingly upset with both the center right and center left. And that is a phenomenon we're seeing across advanced economies. It is not just in the US. That is what is leading to this populist charge. And it's not going to go away until both the center right and center left parties start acknowledging that and start changing policies in response to that. And if you don't, I do think you're increasing the risk of civil disobedience, of even civil violence and domestic terrorism reemerging across Western societies.
Maybe we could just explain a bit more detail about the politics of rage and low trust voters and how you think that's the issue here.
The Politics of Rage is a piece I wrote in 2016. I'd been working on it for about a year when Brexit came along, but I ended up publishing it in between Brexit and the 2016 US election. So it was great timing from that perspective. And it was focused on exactly this idea that we're increasingly seeing a class of people in Western democracies who feel disenfranchised. And the real key insight from this comes from Samuel Huntington, who is one of the more famous political scientists of the last century. Quite controversial. I think a lot of people thought, maybe racist or otherwise, his Clash of Civilizations thesis internationally, but also his final book, Who Are We?, where he looked at exactly this problem. And the problem is that in a representative democracy, who are the people who are elected to represent you? They tend to be our elites. And that doesn't matter what party you vote for. You have to have money, status, something to be able to put yourself in a position to run for office like that. Even outside of the US where, supposedly money dominates politics. And so as a result, if the elites are increasingly segregated and segmented away from the average person on the street, they don't understand them. They can't be good representatives of them. And so they have pushed a lot of policies that were great for elites, but weren't so great for the average person on the street. And one of the key ones is immigration, right? So a lot of people like to think of this as some sort of racism issue, but I don't think it really is. I mean, it ultimately comes down to if you are an elite, and by the way, I consider myself an elite. Immigration is a great thing. Like, I'm an American. We're here in the UK. I'm now a UK citizen. I have fantastic opportunities all around the world because I have high skills that allow me to work in all these different places. Having lots of low skill labor freely available means that I can have cheaper childcare, cheaper restaurants, all of these things. It's fabulous for me. But if you're an unskilled worker, it ain't so great because now you face a lot more wage competition and job competition from all that unskilled labor coming in. And that is ultimately what drives this wedge between the elites who are representing the people and the average person on the street. And immigration is just one of those issues, but it comes across in trade policies, it comes across in social policies, it comes across in all of these things, which is why it's not easy to capture what is driving this across all these different Western societies into a single issue. Immigration is a good one. It does show up pretty strongly in the data, but it's a whole host of different issues. And it really derives from that point that you have this elite commoner divide, and the commoners have lost trust in their elites, and as such don't show up in the polling because they don't answer the phone.
There's a lot of concern, around domestic civil unrest in the US. Before election, a lot of comparisons drawn with 1968 as a year of street violence in America. And look, we haven't seen that in the pre-election period. We haven't yet seen it, but there's still a lot of fear about the post-election period. Obviously, there's more value in looking forward than back for us. So you could argue that those low-skilled workers may have found in Trump someone who they think does represent them more. Do you feel like that will go some way to assuaging that problem of them getting angrier and angrier?
Let me slightly correct you there. We did have 3 assassination attempts on President-elect Trump. So it wasn't like there wasn't any political violence, right? One of them almost succeeded. And it's been a while since we've had that kind of, obviously you can go back and there have been tons of threats made, but we haven't had actual people arrested on site with guns or bombs as we have 3 times in this election.
There were the bomb threats made to polling stations. I guess I was thinking more of like street violence.
Absolutely. So yes, let's get to that. I just wanted to highlight that, look, you need to think about the fact that violence has already been perpetrated. And so you're exactly right to be worried about it. And I think so far there is, at least on the populist or right-wing side, Trump's overwhelming victory is going to assuage some of that. Now, of course, you do have the left-wing radicals who have been fed a steady diet for the last 8 years that Trump is literally the reincarnation of Hitler. So you should expect that some of them, and by the way, left-wing violence has been increasing very rapidly. It's been actually the fastest growing category of domestic terrorism in the United States. Still behind right-wing terrorism, mind you, but it is the fastest growing. So you have a significant potential for that. But I think actually you should be looking to Europe. So take a look at what happened here shortly after the UK election. We had riots all across this country. Now, a lot of people want to blame misinformation for that. And I think that's a little bit like blaming a bullet for a murder. Yes, the misinformation was the proverbial match that lit the fire, but clearly people were deeply, deeply upset and on edge for some other reason. And I think part of that is that one of the things that happened here in the UK is that you had the Conservative Party defensively try and co-opt a lot of the populist rhetoric of UKIP, now Reform Party, and say, hey, we're actually on your side. We're the ones who are going to deliver for you on this. And then they didn't. They never actually meant it. And so they continued, definitely from the right wing, but continued elitist policies. And then you come into this election where we really, in the UK, had no choice of an actual populist party if that's what your leanings were. Labor didn't represent that anymore. You didn't even have left-wing populism in the form of Jeremy Corbyn. You had effectively a semi-Blairite Keir Starmer. You had the conservatives who had completely lost everyone's faith. You had the Lib Dems, who are the most elite of elite parties. And reform really wasn't competitive anywhere, despite the fact that they actually won a larger share of the vote than the Lib Dems. So I think there was a tremendous amount of frustration. And in there is a lesson across Europe as we go into a snap election in Germany coming up. But I also think, to your original question, it's a lesson for the US. How much did the Congress and the Senate that was elected along with President Trump, how much did they actually represent that populism that he represents? We'll have to see and find out. If they don't, I think you may have a very similar situation to what you faced with the conservatives.
On a previous episode, I discussed with Tina Fordham. She was very concerned about the idea that the result wouldn't be clear on November the 5th. But obviously we do have a clear result. So that's kind of one bullet dodged in that respect, that we won't see the legal challenges, people challenging the result. As it does seem that there's not that angle of people saying this hasn't been a fair election, or there's been foul play in some respect. We're not seeing that. On face value, I'd say that seems to suggest that there's less likely to be an immediate risk of street violence, civil unrest between, let's say, now and the inauguration. Would you agree with that? Do you think that the risk is more just sort of general medium term under a Trump presidency now, in terms of the left wing that have certainly lost this election and will be feeling pretty sore right now?
I think it's probably true that it is a sort of more of a latent risk now. But I do think, it was interesting that you used the words dodge a bullet, because I think all of us dodged a bullet with President-elect Trump when that assassin's bullet just grazed his ear. I think you would have had massive violence from the right had that actually been successful. And I don't think, as I said, the danger has gone away. Again, you have a lot of people on both sides. When you have large groups of people, there are going to be radicals among them. And you've told all these radicals, this is Hitler. Hitler is coming for you. So I don't think we can discount the idea that, frankly, we're out of the woods yet. The other thing that I do think, is an important thing to think about, and I think especially if you're thinking about investments or reinsuring in specific states across the United States, one of the things that supposedly a bipartisan group, but when you look at it, it's really never Trump Republicans colluding with Democrats to war game a Trump presidency and how states and local governments can resist it. And we just had Governor Gavin Newsom of California calling a special session of the assembly there to look into exactly that. How are they going to Trump-proof their state? Now, this is going to lead to potential flashpoints and confrontations when you have both sides are extremely mistrustful of each other. And, the sad fact is both sides have actually armed up a lot. I think that's an underreported fact, but gun sales have gone through the roof. And where we can track that, again, one of the fastest groups collecting guns is Democrats. So this is not a safe situation in any sense just because we had a landslide victory. I think it just makes it more latent.
So let's switch the focus to foreign affairs. So again, to post-election geopolitical risk. Do you feel that there is an elevated or a lowered geopolitical risk between, let's say, first of all, between now and January the 20th inauguration?
The background context is always important here. The way I've put it, and I actually have For those who want to look at it, it's one of the pieces that I put out free, a piece called Global Entropy. I'll warn you, it's very long, but it sort of lays out my view of the long-term deterioration of the post-war liberal order that was largely established by the US after World War II. And that's been eroding for 30 years. But we're now at a point where it's eroded sufficiently that there's actually a risk of a tipping point here. And you can see, whether it's through Russia's invasion of Ukraine or live fire drills crossing the median line in Taiwan, or actions in Venezuela, elsewhere, that the adversaries are very clearly feeling they're potentially ready to challenge the United States.
So if you have that sort of medium to long term, those conditions are ripe then. So is the transition period before inauguration risky in the sense that those adversaries might be there in a position to challenge the US?
Yes. And I think this is one of the things, I have a very different view of Donald Trump than I think is the consensus. There's I think, a consensus view that he loves fellow autocrats and is going to be very cozy with Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. And as a result, those foreign leaders are really excited to see him in office. And I think it's exactly the opposite. I think they look at Donald Trump exactly the way most other people do. That guy's unpredictable. He's crazy. I have no idea what he's going to do.
Yeah.
There's, I think, an increased sense of urgency on all of their parts. Hey, I want to change the facts on the ground before January 21st so that if he's going to negotiate with me, he's going to have to negotiate for me having a better position.
To use a military analogy, it's in case that Russia or Iran might try to seize the initiative. And the obvious question is whether Russia would have preferred Trump or not.
I think it's very clear. It's funny. You always have to take anything President Putin says with a grain of salt because he is always trying to play with people's heads. But I took him at face value when he said back in the spring, I would prefer President Biden to President Trump. And the reason why I take him at face value on that is because his reason, he actually gave the reason, and it was exactly the one that fits. He said, I prefer him because he's more predictable. And what do you want in your adversary but predictability? That's like probably the feature you would most want in an adversary is predictability.
I think it's probably fair to assume Harris wasn't exactly vociferous on foreign policy, but she did represent continuity with Biden.
Exactly.
It was notable that Netanyahu's Israel was very quick to congratulate Donald Trump on winning the presidency. But for the other adversarial powers that Israel faces and the US might face in the region, Iran is obvious one. Yeah, they also going to fear the uncertainty.
I do think that that's actually one area where, as worrying as it has been, I think some of the recent developments are actually somewhat stabilizing. So the first point is we had this discussion about did Putin prefer Trump or not. I actually laid out a couple months ago a couple of tests about who preferred whom. And one of them was Russia had made really significant efforts to drive towards this key logistical hub in eastern Ukraine called Pokrovsk. And I said, if that falls, it precipitates potentially the fall of the entire eastern portion of Ukraine very quickly. And that would put President Putin in a pickle if he really did prefer President Trump, because he'd effectively be handing the election to him by inflicting yet another strategic disaster on the Biden administration. Now, interestingly, they paused. They've been 7 kilometers outside of Pokrovsk, and they haven't moved any closer, but they've moved all the rest of the line. So they are clearly consolidating the line and getting ready for a final offensive there. Israel was the exact opposite. Israel very clearly thought that President Trump would be good for them. And so they aggressively pursued a high-profile war against Hezbollah, Hamas, exchanges with Iran. But one of the interesting things that came out of that is I think that they saw that they are very vulnerable themselves. there were a lot of interesting signals that came out of the most recent exchanges between Iran and Israel. The first is that using overwhelming numbers of missiles, Iran was able to penetrate the Iron Dome and other anti-missile systems and do some pretty extensive damage in Israel. The second is that clearly Israel realizes that it doesn't have sufficient long-range strike capabilities to launch back. So it went and used manned planes to go deliver precision-guided munitions in the most recent attack. That suggests they're starting to see a realism that they're also starting to see in southern Lebanon, where they've actually been bogged down despite the fact that they have taken out almost all of Hezbollah's senior leadership, a significant portion of their special operations forces. They're still getting bogged down early on in the border there, and they still haven't eradicated Hamas a year later. So I do think that both sides are starting to see, hey, this is really not a fight either one of us are going to win. And then you interject, as I suggested, this very unpredictable character in Trump. I think this actually helps the Middle Eastern situation. I think we'll probably see less potential for this to explode further.
There's probably time for one last country to focus on, and that's China. I believe probably the most important one to last, because I don't think the city or the insurance market particularly cared too much about Iranian opportunities, but there's so much caught up in how the US and China interact in the next few years. Obviously, tensions over Taiwan, the previously leaked assessment that China might try and move on Taiwan before the end of this decade. But there is this general assumption too that whilst Trump may do some deal making that might give Putin some of what he wants in Ukraine, for example, which will cause a lot of dissatisfaction in other Western countries, there is an assumption that Trump will be quite hardline with China. Is that fair to say?
It is absolutely fair to say China is a serious issue. You know, the leaked assessment of China potentially trying to take Taiwan this decade, I don't think you need a leak. There have been multiple analyses of these. My own personal analysis of this situation is it absolutely behooves them to do this as quickly as they possibly can, because everything is moving against them from here. And they clearly do have an advantage. So I think that's an extraordinarily dangerous situation. And ultimately, the U.S. and I think the rest of the West, you can see it in Europe as well, is realizing that this is a serious threat, and especially a sort of duopoly among Russia and China, where China provides the technology and the material and the manufacturing, and Russia provides all the resources that they need for that, all in a self-contained Eurasian package that can't be interdicted on the high seas or disrupted. That is a serious, serious threat to the entire West. And so you are seeing increasing technology controls, trade controls, other things. And what you really have to be concerned about here is what I've been calling the great bifurcation, that you can already see it happening, but increasingly technologies are going to be incompatible. You're either going to be on a Chinese 5G system or a Western 5G system, but you're not going to have ones that do both. You're going to be on a Chinese payment system or a US payment system, the SWIFT system. You're going to be trading with one or the other. That will probably not be quite as bifurcated as those other things, but it will still be quite bifurcated. And as we're starting to see, each side is increasingly starting to use its monopolization of production or its ability to seize assets as economic weapons against the other. Expect more of that. That's the direction of travel here.
Well, look, Marvin, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me on. It's been a great conversation. Really enjoyed it. Thank you, Dave.
That's all for this time. Thanks for listening. I've been your host, David Benyon, and I'd like to thank my guest, Marvin Barth of Thematic Markets. I'll be back very soon for another episode, bringing more geopolitical risk insights from across the insurance and risk transfer markets and beyond. Please tune in next time. This podcast was produced by Peter McGill and Lawrence Durkin made the music.